Hello, everyone. Paul Menig with Business Accelerants, helping business owners and leaders to get more money out of their business and more time for their lives. I had a chance earlier this week to present to some people uh, that were friends of Prosper Portland and one of the manufacturing extension programs. I'd like to repeat that for all of you here today. Let me begin by sharing my screen. I've had the opportunity to work in the transportation industry for several decades now, working on passenger cars, light trucks, and heavy trucks, and even some exposure to agricultural and heavy-duty mining equipment. I mentioned the extension programs. The National Institute of Standards and Technology actually has a program that works within all 50 states, even one of the regions apparently, because there are 51 centers that are focused on helping manufacturing companies in the United States. Here in Oregon, it's the Oregon Manufacturing Extension Program. In Washington State, it's Impact Washington. And in Idaho, it is Tech Help. So if you're a manufacturing company, you really should be involved with these companies. They have some resources available to them to help you with consulting. And because they're partially funded by the government, they can often be a good resource for some things that you might need to have in your organization with manufacturing operations, lean, and other things. And some go beyond that as well. As part of this presentation, I need people to understand where I come from. I've written a book on strategic planning, trying to take what I learned in the industrial conglomerate corporate world and bring it down to the small businesses that are anywhere from $1 million to $50 or $200 million in size. This is based partially on Michael Porter's 5 forces analysis that I learned early in my career in the mid-'80s at Eaton Corporation. I like to take a look at the sales and marketing channels to make sure that we understand everything that's going on, who's making profits, what's selling, and who the ideal client is. But I also like to look at the supply chain and outsourcing, looking at the products, the services, the supplies, and the information that you get. And in some cases, it's now even your labor that is a contractor that is working for you. Externally, we have market constraints, such as many people in manufacturing must have some sort of an ISO qualification, certification at this point in time. It's no longer a differentiator, it's kind of a constraint in the market. But then we have the government and all of the constraints it puts on, whether it's OSHA or the FAA for some operations, FCC for others, all kinds of things that go on with the government. Risks of disruption, we've seen that tremendously this year, but it's happening all the time. There's always the chance of fire. There's always a chance of somebody dying, somebody being hurt, and anything that can happen to disrupt your business. I've had tsunamis and fires in factories that caused tremendous problems for me over the years. You need to understand your competition, and many people will tell me, well, we don't have any competition. And the truth is, you've got at least one competitor that you've never thought of, that is your customer just won't do anything. The constraints that they have, the momentum they have, doing nothing is often the easiest thing that they can do. And I'm a favorite of technology. I love to see how technology has changed businesses over time and centuries, but also tremendously right now as everything is changing. And then internal to your company is your product, your processes, and your people that you have. As I said, I've been involved in the transportation industry for quite some time, and I look at it as moving people and freight safely, efficiently, and reliably, getting them from, say, point A to point B. Now, that can also be done inside the factory, getting it from the dock to the production line and getting it to the shipping dock. So the same sorts of things that we're talking about on a broad scale, on a global basis, can also be done inside the factory. But on a global basis, we're talking about going from order to a factory to a warehouse. It's taken by lift trucks and planes and trains and ships and small delivery vehicles, and now even down to autonomous delivery vehicles. So there's a lot that goes on that's similar between transportation and manufacturing, and almost everything you manufacture, sooner or later, has to be transported to the customer. E-commerce is great, but it still ends up being delivered to somebody's front door, to a mailbox, to a drop box, to their trunk in their car, or something. Just as I was making this presentation, that morning, I had this appear in my email, a release this week showing the recovery that is expected in the transportation market and the freight volumes and weight that we're going to be talking, and showing that over the next decade, you see here it says till 2031, this is one of the many companies that produce market forecasts, that we're talking a continued growth in freight. It tends to follow GNP because freight is largely determined by the number of people that we have in the United States and the people that we're servicing globally. I also had this particular item show up as I was doing some research for another activity, and I saw this and found it of interest that the industry constitutes the largest manufacturing sector in the US. This is vehicle manufacturing, transportation, and it represents 3.62 million jobs here in the United States. So this is a company, a trade association that I'm part of, that began in 1904, 1 year after Henry Ford started his production line. For this particular presentation, I used a lot of different current resources out of the industry. The American Trucking Association's Trends 2020, which is a purchasable item. The Department of Transportation's recently released National Strategic Freight Plan, their Pathways to the Future of Transportation, and earlier they released the Autonomous Vehicle 4.0 guidelines. Automotive World is a subscription-based magazine and organization that puts on webinars, provides research, and offers daily press releases of what's going on in the transportation industry. I've mentioned the Heavy Duty Manufacturers Association. They run some pulse webinars on a monthly basis, and some of their resources are ACT Research and FTR Associates. I'm also a member of the National Truck Equipment Association. This is for all the people that are doing work trucks. And then there's some information I used from the Federal Highway Administration. And you see there in my classic red maroon color, numbers lie. And that's that you really have to understand whatever numbers are presented to you. They can be made to look very promising, and they can be made to look very negative, depending on how you read them, what headlines you put out there. You also need to very carefully understand the underlying assumptions and what exactly those measures are before you make some decisions. The National Freight Plan had this particular diagram, which I thought was very interesting, showing by county in these little lights where manufacturing jobs are in the United States. You can see that there's a lot that is east of the Mississippi River, of course. And then there's a few things in Texas. And then we have California, and we have opportunities here in the Pacific Northwest with the Seattle area, with Portland area, with Boise, Idaho, and other areas, and a little outpost in Spokane in Washington, but still some opportunities for growth in the states. Now, there was also this diagram of the major freight pathways, whether they be road, rail, water. This one did not show pipelines, but there are some others that show pipelines. And you can see that heavy concentration of interstate highway in the east, and less so here in the west, and large portions of the west that do not have major interstate highways. I see an opportunity for us to have some highway construction and grow more in the Pacific Northwest. An interesting thing I did is let's put those two diagrams together. And now you see how an overlay of why the manufacturing is where it is, why the highways are where they are, why the rails are where they are. And so we're a little disadvantaged here in the Pacific Northwest today, say compared to the ports in Los Angeles, San Diego, and Long Beach. They have a much better opportunity to move things than we do. Seattle has some with the rail here going to Minneapolis, and we have some rail coming out of Portland, but we've had difficulties with our ports here. So some opportunities that I see, if we can improve our highway infrastructure, if we can improve the rail systems here in the Pacific Northwest, we could improve our manufacturing and take greater advantage yet of what's happening in Asia. I often get asked, what's a truck or what's a commercial vehicle? This is a diagram from the Federal Highway Administration showing how here in the United States we classify vehicles. And I find these little color pictures to be helpful for people to understand what a particular size truck is. Trucks are based on the weight on an axle, which then affects the pavement that we're running on. And there has to be a certain spread. You'll see here, a very tight spread. You'll see here a very tight spread. And then here you see, a longer spread. That has to do with the bridge laws that we have in the country. Whether you can run a double or a triple depends on your state laws. Unfortunately, it's weight on the axle, but this diagram doesn't show you what the weights are. So here's another diagram that I often use that gives a better idea of the weights that are required for each of those classes. And here to the right, I've given you what might be a more typical thing that people would think of. They're accustomed to seeing an F-150, the best-selling vehicle in the United States. Then 250, 350, 550s. Even now, we're getting back to having F-650s and 750s. And I'm expecting that we're going to see something here in the Class 8 market for Ford in the near future from some things that I've read. But that'll give you an idea of what a truck is, what a truck is. Now, what's a commercial vehicle? That's a little different. You can have a commercial vehicle in any one of those classes. Certainly, here's up in the heavy-duty classes, a mining truck. Here's a Class 8 truck. Here's a Class 5, 6 municipal bus. You would also see it with a coach. And then here are some Class 3 vehicles that are typical. Here's a device that's not even in a class yet, but would be a commercial vehicle for delivering groceries and pizza and beer to a dorm room, for instance. And then here are the typical Class 1, 2, and 3 vehicles that are now more and more becoming commercial vehicles. Some people may not be aware that you can lease a vehicle from Uber if you want to be an Uber driver. And so Uber itself is a commercial vehicle company. There are many, many ways to participate in manufacturing within the transportation commercial vehicle industry. We often think about the fleets. We hear them, UPS and FedEx and Wilson Logistics here in Portland and others. And then at the other end is the Tier 3 supplier making screws, nuts, bolts, bottles, lamps, all kinds of things. And they may or may not be anywhere from a Tier 3 supplier to a Tier 1 supplier, depending on whether they ship directly to the vehicle OEM's plant or to something short of that. Then we have the vehicle OEMs. Here's just a few that are in the commercial vehicle industry, including new entrants here for Lion Electric. You could put Tesla into this category as well. And here's an important one called the upfitter. The National Truck Equipment Association exists for all those people who take a Ford chassis or some other chassis and then put other work equipment on top of it, cabinets, cranes, cable devices for laying cable for the communications companies. And then we have leasing companies, which are very powerful. I just show one here, Penske. And all of these arrows are an attempt to show the different relationships that exist. Some are unique and proprietary, and some are used across a variety of different suppliers. And these relationships are key in many cases to what's going on. This is an attractive market because it's a reasonably good size. I've worked in medical and industrial equipment where we might talk about hundreds of something a year. I've worked in aerospace where we might talk hundreds or thousands of something a year. And then unfortunately, we're not as big as many consumer things, which are talking many, many millions, but we are talking passenger cars are around, in the United States, around 16 million. Globally, trucks and cars are around 65 to 100 million units a year. And if you look here, we see class 1 to 2 in the US representing about 2 to 3 million vehicles a year. Class 3 to 5, another 300,000. Class 6 to 7, only about 100,000. And then class 8, anywhere from 150 to sometimes as much as 300,000 units. And then you see here a total for class 3 to 8 in the 500,000 to 750,000 level. You can add in Canada, but note that they don't show class 1, 2 here, and they break it up perhaps a little differently. No. Mexico is broken up a little differently. They don't show class 3 here. But then they show for the US, Mexico, Canada agreement total, and showing something on the order of 500,000. But note, this is class 4 to 8, which is why I say you have to be careful. Numbers can be lying if you're not careful. Somebody could quote something here for class 3 to 8 and then quote something here for class 4 to 8, and there would be a problem. This is another way of picturing the markets. On the left here is the large class 1 and the large class 2, and then the class 3 to 8 and larger vehicles that we're talking. If we look at the class 8 market on the right-hand side, we have fewer people to deal with, and we have two major companies here in the Pacific Northwest. Western Star and Freightliner are both Daimler Trucks North America, and Peterbilt and Kenworth are both PACCAR. So we have Portland and we have Seattle area. Then on the East Coast, we have Mack and Volvo Truck, which are one company. And then in Chicago area, we have International. So I put these lines here to help you see the 4 major manufacturers of Class 8 vehicles. If you look at it on a global basis, it is much larger. And of course, there are something like 20 plus manufacturers. Now I've moved to the European designation of 6 ton rather than thousands of pounds. So roughly 6 tons, 12,000 pounds. And this is from 2019. And you see all of the manufacturers globally, including people in Eastern Europe, Russia, Asia, and China being a rather large market. And here are the 2 Pacific Northwest manufacturers, together representing almost 600,000 vehicles. Now that's in the class 12,000 pounds and above. If we look at it in the class 8 only, 16 ton and above, then we see that PACCAR is about 175,000 vehicles and Daimler is around 305,000 vehicles. Now this is global production though, not just the Pacific Northwest. I'm pointing out the 2 that are big companies here in the Pacific Northwest. PACCAR is based here, but has production and brands in Europe for DAF and can't think of the other one offhand. And then Daimler has Mercedes-Benz in several different countries and Freightliner, Western Star here. It's interesting just to point out, if you see Daimler with 305 and 16 ton plus, and if we subtract that from the 375, you see that Daimler doesn't have but 75,000 or 70,000 units between 6 ton and 16 ton. And similarly, PACCAR with 199 and 6 ton plus, but 175 here, you'll see they only have around 25,000 that are between 6 ton and 16 ton. So they are very heavily into the Class 8 and less so in the smaller markets. Transportation has been a cyclical market for all the years that I've been involved in it. I'd say I started it around 1985 in this market. So you'll see some charts going back to 83. So you see here we had not much impact to the dot-com bust, and then we had some good years, and you'll see that long before the Great Recession, we had already declined. Then we were doing well, and after the Great Recession, we had a slight decline in 2016. We had you'd think we had a tremendous year in 2018 and 2019. But I'd like to point out, you have to understand your numbers. This is orders. And you'll see something different when I show you a chart for production and how this high order year and this low order year changed into an almost steady production set of years. Here again is orders, and note that this goes back to 1990. Here you can see a recession in the 95 timeframe. Here you do see the impact of the dot-com bubble, but before it happened rather than as it happened. This was the best year so far in the 35 years I've been in the industry, was 2006. And then here you see 2018, as I said, was another banner year for orders. Now, here we're talking build levels. And here I'd like you to take note of how the build levels are not nearly as volatile as the production orders are. We will build to inventory, manage our inventory quite well, but we were unable to really deal with the recession this year and what happened. But you can see here in July, we had great orders. And remember, orders went down in 19, but look at how we basically maintained the production levels over that 2018 to 2019 years. Here in 2018, we were largely constrained in the industry by build. The factories were running as full tilt as they could. They continued that way, and here they were building down that backlog of orders. This chart shows another little bit of interest. Here is the production for class 6 to 15 ton that I mentioned. And then here you see the larger market for greater than 15 ton. And you see how this is a little less volatile than this has been. And depending on how you look at it, you might see a slight growth over the many years. This goes back to 2007. We do increase people. We increase freight every year. That's something that will always change. Every business needs some sort of key performance statistics, and I encourage you to really understand who your customer is and who your customer's customer is. For instance, I have a client that, several clients actually, that have delivered to a tier 1 supplier to the recreational vehicle industry. Both the tier 1 supplier and the end user supplier are public companies that have to provide information to the SEC and to their shareholders. They do investor presentations. All of that information is publicly available, and I encourage you to look at it so that you understand your customer and what key performance metrics they are going after. I took these next few slides from the 2019 annual report for Daimler. And some things I'd like to point out is notice that Daimler is made up of cars, trucks, vans, buses, and mobility services. So they're tracking revenue, EBIT, return on sales, investment in property and equipment. What are they spending on research and development? How many units did they sell? How many employees do they have? And they're doing it by each of these areas. Then they're tracking their share and comparing their share to their competitors. I often don't see enough in smaller companies looking at how do you compare to your customers, how do you compare to your competitors? And there's a lot of information out there, especially through trade associations and benchmarking reports that you can get your hand on. Daimler also looks at what region, so it's by product area as well as by regions that they will be looking at to see what's going on. And here again, another picture by region, and this is unit sales as opposed to revenue dollars. Then they look on the return on sales, again, by business over years, and then balance sheet and cash flows. Here's the cash flow. I don't see enough of smaller companies understanding that the profit and loss statement creates something at the bottom which should be cash, and then your cash flow statement determines where you are taking that cash and using it. Are you paying off loans? Are you reinvesting in buying equipment? Are you buying property? What are you doing with the cash? You don't want it to just sit in the bank necessarily, though that's important, as we all were reminded of in this last year. And then we have the balance sheet, which shows their assets and liabilities, and then what's left in equity in the company. Earlier this year, people had to be careful with the EIDL and the PPP loans to make sure that they were properly shown in terms of cash coming into the company and that they were also representing a liability. I haven't seen anybody have their stuff forgiven yet, no reports on that, and I know people who are going through the process, but until that loan is forgiven, you have a liability on your books. So one last picture of the Daimler Group in the numbers and things, showing the key metrics that they are following. If you look at their strategic plan, which again is available on the website, you'll be able to see some other things that they are focusing on, especially in terms of diversity and sustainability, which are key trends now. Here's an interesting diagram. Way back in the mid-'80s, the economist at Eaton showed me that typically the transportation industry goes down 6 months before the rest of the economy in a recession, and that somehow it's about 35 to 50% drop. And so you see here, we went from 30 million euro in this case down to just above 15 to maybe 18 million euro. So not quite 50%, maybe 35%. And then we come back. Now, here you see that in this case, the Daimler revenue doubled in the intervening years over the decade. And here you see their operating margin stayed pretty constant, not what you'd see for a software company or a high-tech company, unfortunately. Then on this, you see what happened with the other company here in the Pacific Northwest, PACCAR. So they went from, this is an index from 1987. Again, you have to be careful what the things say, but we went from an index of 500 to under 200 at PACCAR. So that's more than 50%. And here you'll see from their low point of an index of under 200, they went to almost 600. So they had a 3x improvement in this particular index. Note that this goes back to 1987 as the basis. That's just 2 years short of the time frame I would say I've been in the transportation industry. Before that, I was in aerospace, defense, industrial automation, and medical equipment in my career. If you look at PACCAR, here's a similar chart showing their revenue going back to 1983 and how it has grown over time and the slight dips. And then their operating profit, they are very, very focused on operating profit and not declaring losses and doing things to make that happen. But they've done extremely well. So one word of caution, when you're dealing with PACCAR, you're going to see that they value profits and they're going to be hard on you in terms of making you pay and deliver to them at low prices. One more chart showing their net profit trend here in dollars and then in euro, because all of these companies, even though based or heavily represented here in the Pacific Northwest, they are global operations. And if you get business with one of the divisions, you may well have an opportunity for business with another division. You may find that you're better off getting your initial production at one of the other divisions where there are lower volumes to establish yourself. So I'd like to touch on 5 trends that you need to consider. And notice the word here, CASE, where the C is connectivity, the A is autonomous operation, the S is sometimes called safe or shared. I prefer safe. And then the E is electrification, but I sometimes broaden that to think of environmental, because whether you're talking a battery powered vehicle or a hydrogen fuel cell recharging a battery, natural gas, propane, biodiesel, or something, we're all intended to try to improve the environment. And then I think it's worth seeing a few comments about the USMCA new agreement replacing the NAFTA. I think that represents some opportunities for manufacturing companies in the Pacific Northwest for transportation. The Department of Transportation recently published a number of things related to autonomous vehicles and vehicle to everything communications. Sometimes I'm seeing now V2E instead of V2X, where the X represents anything. What is the anything that we're talking about? We're talking about vehicle to infrastructure. We're talking about vehicle to vehicle. We're talking about vehicle to the cloud or vehicle to the network. We're talking vehicle communicating to pedestrians. And I believe this U represents user. And this diagram just shows the same connections, but in slightly different things, and brings up the term C to V2X for commercial vehicle to anything communications. Autonomous gets a lot of attention, but I'll tell you, electrification is going to come first and is kind of a requirement around the world because of the environmental constraints that are being placed upon them. Here are 10 companies today. There have already been companies that came into this industry, worked on autonomous, and have already folded and will never be seen again after tens and hundreds of $millions of investment. So we have Embark, we have Einride working with Volvo, Daimler, which is planning to have autonomous vehicles before the end of the year. If you get into the details of this, there's an SAE level 0 to 5, and Daimler and Volvo are heavily focused, along with PACCAR, on bringing level 2 highly safe vehicles using artificial intelligence and machine learning to do things, and then focusing nearer term, say 2005 and 7, for real production of level 4 vehicles, which means under certain conditions, the driver doesn't have to be involved with running the vehicle, and maybe if governments change things, we'll be able to remove the driver from the vehicle. Very, very few people are talking about level 5 at this point in time, especially in the commercial vehicle industry, unless we're talking very low-speed shuttle buses on private property and low-speed delivery vehicles. Locomation here just signed a deal with a company that has facilities here in Portland called Wilson Logistics. They will be retrofitting 1,000 vehicles or more in order to do what's called platooning. We've all seen, especially in August and September, the military does platooning exercises, lines and lines of military vehicles out there. In this particular case, you would have the following vehicle not have to be driven by a driver. It would follow the vehicle in front of it automatically. Another thing related to safety is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. We call it FMCSA. Started a program in January of this year, it was announced, and working with various entities within the trucking industry to help accelerate the technology adoption of safety equipment. Specifically, they're looking at automatic driver assistance systems. That's what ADAS is. And specifically the systems for braking, disc brakes, lane departure warning, and in some cases lane departure keeping, and then monitoring either the road in front with a camera, and now more people are beginning to be able to monitor the driver as well and have acceptance of that to avoid driver distraction and other issues. I mentioned electrification. It is a huge potential, and there are many, many companies that are involved in electrifying commercial vehicles now. The California Air Resources Board has been heavily involved, and I can't think of the name, I'm sorry right now, but they have this global Drive to Zero website that they came up with in March of this year. They announced it, and they are tracking all of the electrified vehicles that are reported and talking about their availability and letting you know by which particular area they are. I'd recommend that you look at this to see what opportunities there are, because we're looking at really low volumes today, sometimes only 10 vehicles, that are going to grow into large numbers. Rivian, for instance, has been invested in by Ford and Amazon, and we're looking at, they have backlog orders of 100,000 units right now. This is another slide that showing the model availability and the expectation of it almost doubling by 2023. This slide shows the zero emissions vehicles available by the type of vehicle. Note this medium duty truck, and that's because this is an application very suited to being able to recharge a battery every day. The vehicles tend to come back to the same place, and you can set up chargers in your facility. Amazon, UPS, for instance, would fall into this category as well. They're somewhere between these two. And then transit bus has been a leader in electrification, again, because those buses come back to the station each night. You can look at it also by vehicle type and looking at the number of offerings that each has. So that's one of the biggest trends, is electrification. So we talked about connectivity, vehicle to anything communications. We talked about autonomous operation and safety levels and partial autonomous operation. We talked about safety, and we talked about electrification. Okay, for those of you who've been listening, I had a short pause there, and I checked. It's CalSTART, a very important organization that is operating in California. The California Air Resources Board and the state of California provide a bit of funding to that organization. They have been an absolute leader in the commercial vehicle industry and looking at justifying what it takes to make electric vehicles operate in anything that is low environmental impact to the industry. So again, CASE, connectivity, autonomy, safety, and electrification are environmentally friendly. Now let's turn a little bit to the USMCA, the new trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. This is one infographic that I found. I can't testify to you that it is 100% correct to the final approved USMCA. I couldn't find a date for when this was done, but it gives a couple of pieces of information that I think are important for transportation. The biggest one is right here at the very top. Vehicles have to go from a component manufacturing content in NAFTA, in Mexico, Canada, United States, of 62.5% content and rise to 75% content. It has to be done by year, and it has to be done a little bit differently between the light-duty vehicles and the heavy-duty vehicles. That tells me that the auto and truck companies, commercial vehicle companies, are going to be looking for suppliers who have more content done here in North America. That could be Canada and Mexico, but there's a second part of it as well here down in the labor provisions. 40 to 45% of all the parts must be made by workers who earn at least $16 an hour. That is going to change, in my opinion, how much labor is done in Mexico versus the United States and Canada, or it's going to seriously impact the labor content in Mexico in terms of the wage rates. There are laws being passed in Mexico that are changing the rates of pay, but I don't expect it to rise from where it is today to $16 an hour. Again, putting these two, the labor provisions and the automotive content regulations together, suggests to me that there's a tremendous opportunity for people in the United States in particular to get back into or expand their production of parts for the transportation industry. This is a more recent slide. You can see the date of enforcement here. I'm going to enlarge it a little bit for you as well. And here you see the parts. There are three different types of parts that they've been identified: core, principal, and complementary. I'm not sure which is which. And here you see how the content changes depending on which type of part you are. And then also here it says whether you're pass car or light trucks, and there's different things here for the heavy trucks. So we go from 60% principal and 50% complementary to 64% principal and 54% complementary. So those are tremendous opportunities for you to change what you're doing in the transportation industry. I encourage you to take advantage of that and get to know the people that are in your organization as customers and where they're going. Another point to make is, regardless of where people are in the cycle, there are always new products being developed, not just electrified ones, but other than that. So here, just as I was about to make this presentation earlier this week, finally, after years, Daimler Trucks, Western Stars brand, announced their new vocational vehicle for construction and off-road and other markets. It was in debate probably for 5 years from the first time it started until it was being announced. There are probably even today opportunities for still being what we were calling complementary parts a moment ago to be put on this vehicle. There were other parts that were up for grabs as recently as 2 years ago before there was a final selection in such parts as lamps and mirrors, and for instance on this. So you can bet that there are more variations of this truck still planned, and that there are new trucks replacing this to employ the uses of all the people in R&D. I'll admit, getting selected for a part in a commercial vehicle at either PACCAR or Daimler is very tough. They will have teams of people. They will have quality organizations that will do on-site visits and do their own equivalent of an ISO audit. They will have warranty people looking to see how you've been doing. When they say delivery, they don't mean shipped on time. They mean arrived at the dock on time in proper sequence. I can remember times where a supplier was forced to take a trailer load of transmissions or axles, go out into the parking lot, unload the trailer, and repack the trailer in the proper sequence of axles in order to back up to the dock so that those axles or transmissions would come off the vehicle in the right order. Because in effect, backed up to the dock, that trailer was part of their factory and their warehouse, and everything had been staged properly. So be careful. Certainly cost is a factor, but it will not be the only factor. And any company should be looking at dual sourcing, maybe triple sourcing. And so there are always opportunities to be that second source of something. There's also issues between your OEM pricing and your aftermarket pricing, depending on the company. The same sorts of things will go on with any one of those other smaller companies that are involved in transportation vehicle manufacture, but each will have their own ways of doing things. There's a lot of benefit to being part of a trade association. You can get networking, you can get benchmarking, you can get lobbying for what needs to be done, you can get to know people. I have found that once people got into the transportation industry, they got hooked on the fun and the people that are in this industry. So a couple of key ones: American Trucking Associations, the Technology and Maintenance Council of the American Trucking Association, and there are many other councils within ATA. The National Truck Equipment Association, they have a work truck show in Indianapolis every year in March, as well as a electric and hybrid vehicle show. The Truck Trailer Manufacturers Associations, they are the ones that do the trailers, whether specialized, dry van, or refrigerated. If you're talking the smaller trailers or you're talking the recreational vehicle towables, that's typically handled by the National Association of Trailer Manufacturers. The Heavy Duty Manufacturers Association is part of a larger organization, the Motor Equipment Manufacturers Association. Very good for doing things, 177 members, many of which are the Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers. I did not spell out any definition for SAE or IEEE because they tell me that they are just SAE and IEEE today. Historically, they were something else. But SAE is important, especially as well as IEEE, because their recommended practices can be cited in regulations from the government as being required for performance and certification in a vehicle. So IEEE will frequently be referenced by FCC and SAE by a number of different organizations. The things that they cannot do, though, is they cannot lobby because they are 501c3 organizations, whereas the others are 501c6s and can do lobbying. So throughout this presentation, I've tried to give you an overview of the trucking industry and share with you my excitement for it and the opportunities that exist, especially in this decade, in the next 5 years, to grow your business into a new area, perhaps for you, or expand in an existing area. I've shown you some important statistics that the OEMs track and that suppliers will track as well, and perhaps it gives some guidance to what you should be looking at in your business. I've discussed the 5 trends of connectivity, autonomy, safety, electrification or environmentally friendly, and the new United States, Mexico, Canada agreement for trade and what that impact and opportunities it presents. So I hope you see that there's some growth opportunities in this changing truck transportation, commercial vehicle transportation world. I've given you some idea of my experience and how sourcing decisions are made. And I've outlined several trade associations that you can benefit from in order to improve your operations. So with that, I thank you for listening. Here's my contact information. You can email me. Phone number is on my website. I would prefer if you use this Calendly to schedule a call with me. I'm frequently on other calls or involved in something that I can't take a call, and better to schedule something on my calendar. So with that, I reiterate, I'm Paul Menig, CEO and with Business Accelerants. My joy is actually to help business owners and business leaders get more money out of their business and more time for their lives. And with that, I wish you a great day, and may God bless and keep you all healthy and safe.